Good afternoon, everybody. How many of you attended the town hall meeting this morning? Did you enjoy that? And so, as you can see, we have two people who were on the town hall this morning. So this is town hall part 2 this afternoon. But I want to thank you for attending this afternoon, and let me thank Dr. Menna for putting together this panel as well as the town hall this morning. She's our senior researcher. And so we hope that this will be a very lively discussion this afternoon as we talk about equity and Black empowerment. We have pulled together a very excellent panel here this afternoon. Derrick, Ashland, a musician, broadcaster, and social entrepreneur. As I mentioned, Melanie, Campbell, who will be joining us later. She's president and CEO of the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation, and she also chairs the Black Women's Roundtable. A good friend and homegirl, Donna Brazile, political strategist, also a member of the board of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. Dr. Errol Henderson, oh, I didn't see Errol down there, fellow political scientist, Penn State professor. Dr. Marc Lamont Hill, CNN political commentator, and Dr. Melanie Price, professor from Rutgers University. We thank them for joining us. Let me just urge you, we are at the foundation, we are trying to be relevant, and we are trying to keep up with the times. And so you might have noticed that we have an app this year. And so we hope that everybody has walked through the convention center, you see all the digital signage, and that you have downloaded the app if you have the capability on your phone. Download the 2012 ALC app and get the conference schedule by, what you need to do is search for CBCF ALC 2012 Companion on iTunes or Google Play. And we also ask you to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Our hashtag is CBCF ALC 2012. I saw somebody on Twitter had complained about the hashtag being too long, but once you type it once, then you can just keep on and you won't have to keep typing it again. But it gives us branding CBCF as well as ALC. So without prolonging this, because I want to be able to sit maybe a few minutes and hear some of the discussion, I want to present your moderator for today, who you've already met. But let me just mention that she joined the foundation 1 year ago. I met her when she was serving as a fellow at the American Political Science Association. And she was going around interviewing former presidents of the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. And she came to Washington and interviewed me for the 40th anniversary of NCOPS. And she produced a wonderful film that I had a chance to see. And she also got some great footage of Dr. Ron Walters as she was traveling around putting together this film. And so we are very pleased that she chose to join the staff of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. She's a graduate of PhD from University of Michigan, a student of Dr. Haynes Walton, for all the political scientists in the room. So at this time, now that we see that Ms. Campbell is here, we can really get this show started. Okay, Dr. Demessie.
Thank you for those nice remarks, Dr. Scott. And welcome to you all. We hope you are having a very engaging and informative conference, and we still have a few days left to go. But the purpose of this particular panel is to also have a more involved conversation. I think it serves us well that it's happening post town hall. You heard a lot of perspectives shared on stage about the importance of voting, but we want to kind of delve deeper and beyond voting to actually empowerment, and we kind of use these terms sometimes loosely, but not necessarily defining it beyond perhaps voting, for instance. And then there's the issue of equality versus equity, right? And we often talk about Black empowerment, and we all have sort of our own definitions of it. So what I wanted to do, since we have such a fabulous group of panelists with me, is for them to each talk about their individual perspectives on what Black empowerment means. So there's equality, right? Everyone having sort of access to the same outcome, and then there's equity, the quality of that outcome. Those are two distinct things, and both are worth discussing in detail. So what we'll do first is I'd like to ask the panelists for about 2 to 3 minutes each to given their respective backgrounds, to enlighten us on what Black empowerment means to you, particularly under President Obama's administration. Obviously, that is a huge marker of achievement, right? But then there's sort of the masses, and then you look at these socioeconomic indicators, and you wonder, are we in fact getting better? Is it, and what is our bar, right? How do we measure that? So we'll start with Donna Brazile, if you can share with us your comments, perspectives on what Black empowerment means, and try to be as specific as possible to all the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I just want Dr. Scott to know, I just tweeted, and it is true, once you put in the hashtag, you don't have to go beyond CB, and just come straight out. So, and if I can do it, anyone in this room can do it. I have over 250,000 Twitter followers. Wow. I've been known to tweet a lot, and I hope to tweet the remarks from the other panelists. So let me be very quick so I can tweet. I believe political empowerment is the ability to influence and shape the policies that impact your lives. Simply stated, I believe to be empowered, the word empowerment is both a noun as well as a verb in my judgment. But to empower, to be empowered is to be involved, to be engaged, and to be, in my judgment, an advocate for the expansion of opportunity for all people. As African Americans, we've had, for the last 30 years, we have utilized our political capital. And yet our political capital has provided dividends to both political parties. But on the other, but while both parties have benefited from our active political engagement and political involvement, I don't think we've been able to reap the dividends from the enormous political capital that we've invested in the two-party system. So I would advocate that while we have been engaged, we've been involved, we've been utilizing our political capital to expand opportunities for others. We have not used it to expand our own opportunities. And if we look at the situation unfolding in my beloved South, things now are reverting back to the 1960s, where we see a resegregation of our politics, in large part because our political capital has been dissipated. It has not been focused, and it has not been utilized in ways that would have enhanced our ability to bargain at the political marketplace, where ideas are shared and political power is utilized to help to keep the status quo or expand opportunities for all people. I want to go deep into that because I do believe that we cannot continue in the 21st century to allow others to utilize our political power, political capital, and not be empowered ourselves. There's no reason why we should vote for someone, whether it's president or Congress or city council or sheriff, and not get nothing out of it. Once you show up at the ballot box, that's the first step of being engaged 100%. When I went out at the age of 9 and organized in my community back in Louisiana, people to register and vote, I was 9 years old, so I couldn't do it myself, although I wanted to. My mother told me I had to wait till I was 18. But I stayed engaged, and I stayed as long as I could until we were able to get a playground. Now, when you vote for president, you don't walk away. When you vote for Congress, you don't walk away. You stay engaged so that you can, leverage that political power, leverage your capital, so that you can enact policies that benefit your community and therefore your people.
Thank you. All right, let's move to, thank you for those comments, to Dr. Melanie Price.
When I was thinking about how we should define Black empowerment, I kept thinking about the fact that it's always been sort of a moving target. That is, Black empowerment is not something to be achieved as it is something to be nurtured and constantly tended to, right? I don't think there's a such thing as this is the moment when we are fully empowered. I think as long as politics continues, there will always be times that we are constantly having to adjust, to reshape, to rethink about how and what it means to be empowered. And I think whether or not we are able to achieve Black empowerment is complicated by a couple of issues in the contemporary. First, it is a shift in the American racial landscape from overt to more subtle or covert forms of racial discrimination. Obviously, in the last 4 years, that overt discussion has become, that subtle has become way less subtle than it has been in previous years. I think the thing that's so interesting watching politics play out in the last year or so is that we see the kind of racial triggering used to trigger white racism that was more implied in the 80s and 90s, and they're just full on out saying it now. But I think the way in which we find it difficult in survey research, for instance, to find people who will just out and out say, I hate Black people, I want Black people to fail. People know that that's something that you pretty much shouldn't say in public, right? So that has made it more difficult because many of the policies that have been put in place to decrease African American political capital are policies that are race neutral in language, right? And so when you say, look, that is particularly bad for Black people, they'll be like, we didn't say anything about Black people. I don't know, you playing the race card. So it's those kinds of discussions that have made it more difficult. And I think also it has become more difficult because we have allowed group membership or racial group membership to be a proxy for allegiance. That is, you Black, I'm Black, surely we have the same goals in mind. And I think that is something that has to be challenged way more often. And so when I think about whether or not Black people are more empowered than the past, the answer is of course. There are many factors that tell us this is the case. The best way is to talk to anybody you know who was alive in the 1960s and old enough to understand politics. Just ask them how their lives were, and they will tell you how much better it is now. So what would Black empowerment look like to me? First, we would have responsive politicians who are actually listening to the totality of their constituency and not just big donors who, I guess my concern is in many of the places where Blacks are in the most dire straits, everybody representing them looks like them. They have Black mayors, Black city councilmen. And so we have to, especially at the local level, be more tuned to not just supporting Black politicians or not just supporting Black people, but supporting Black politicians who make and keep promises to those who are most vulnerable to our community. I think the second thing is we need advocacy organizations that are not just fighting for issues that adversely affect the African American community, but who are doing a better job of framing the arguments about why those battles need to be fought. I find that many times we see Black organizations reacting to questions that are important rather than being out there framing the issue. I was thinking in the last few weeks when we've seen both of the parties do their conventions, Reagan was talking about the myth of the welfare queen in the 1980s. And we're still fighting the battle of the myth of the welfare queen in 2012. People are still talking about this mythical being who lives in a mansion on food stamps, who none of us seem to know. But I think a bigger problem with that is we also ourselves, there's always somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody who is also that welfare queen. We don't never know them directly, but my cousin's sister-in-law is also that person. I think we have to be careful about perpetuating those myths ourselves. And I think third, under conditions of Black empowerment, our most vulnerable citizens would feel and reap the rewards of American citizenship rather than feeling bludgeoned by its policies. I think too often Black citizens become poster children of American dysfunction and the cautionary tale for its worst character. An empowered Black America would be one where citizens are engaged and active in electoral politics, but it would also include those community organizations I described a few minutes ago that help in the rehabilitation of returning incarcerated citizens, that volunteer in neighborhood schools, that are educating and providing young women with information and resources to stop the unnecessary deaths from HIV and AIDS, who are standing in the gap for children who are dying needlessly in urban areas, who are saying to governors that you that when you get rid of so many public sector workers, you are also destroying the Black middle class, who has already lost a considerable amount of wealth through through legally sanctioned predatory lending. I think those, when we're having those kinds of discussions and within organizations and with politicians and with constituents and acting on solutions for those problems, will be probably the best empowered we can be.
Thank you very much. And that's a good segue to Derrick Ashang, who I'm sure is a familiar face to many of you, musician, broadcaster, activist, but I'm going into his background because most people know him from the 2008 campaign when a YouTube video went viral. A gentleman was walking around asking supporters of Obama really targeted questions, probably in a way that would suggest they kind of didn't have a real answer for him. And so they happened to land on this brother right here, who not only spoke articulately and intelligently, but kind of went into all the details of the policies, explaining why he was voting for and supporting President Obama. And it was a very refreshing thing to watch that's the video that went viral, because the sort of stereotypical assumption was, for instance, perhaps you're voting for him simply because he's the first Black, candidate with a real, not the first to run for president, but with a real chance of winning. And so you're someone who sort of sits at the nexus between sort of the young generation and the younger generation. I'll say the young and the younger generation. And so you're someone who's on the ground, not sort of affiliated with any political establishment. So how do you frame Black empowerment? How do you envision that?
Oh, first, thank you, Menna, for the lovely introduction. And I'll try to be brief and think about this in a sort of a broader perspective. So I think there are lots of different ways in which you can articulate what Black empowerment is. I want to speak about one thing that I think is missing a lot of times from the conversation, where I see there is a lot of opportunity. And being that I, unlike some people in Washington, D.C., was actually born in Africa, although certain folks get all the credit for being African, I actually am not a born natural American citizen. I will never be able to be president. I'm a foreigner. I'm an immigrant. I am naturalized. I have all the colonial mentality you could ever want to hear. And a couple of interesting things I've seen in my experience. I'll start from the US and then move back across the Atlantic. A couple of weeks ago, I was acting as social media correspondent for BET, for the RNC, and for the DNC. When we did our broadcast during Mitt Romney's speech, BET's hashtag, BETRNC, trended worldwide on Twitter, #3. What that basically means is the volume of conversation happening on Twitter at the time was greater than on any other topic in the world except for two. That was BET, #3 in the world, covering Mitt Romney. Not what you'd expect. When we had the next week, I think during Michelle Obama's speech, we were trending #2. Michelle Obama, then BET. Part of the reason this happened is because we employed certain techniques to really fuse the broadcast and the digital media in ways that aren't typically done for television broadcasts. But part of it is because Black people over-index on Twitter as a platform in particular. Black folks use it, and typically young Black people, and they use it very, very well. So one of the things that I'm interested in is, instead of, I think a lot of times historically we've looked at Black empowerment as in how do we get in where everyone is and take advantage of those resources that are out there. But I'm interested in how do we leverage what we've already got, the trends we already see in our community, and amplify those to our benefit. How do we not only become the consumers of these amazing platforms, but the creators, the avatars of those platforms, and the beneficiaries of the wealth that comes thereof? I'll flip to the other side of the Atlantic real quick to make my point a little further. Last year, in the first half of 2011, 7 of the fastest growing economies on the planet were in Africa. The #1 fastest growing economy in the world in the first half of last year was my home country, Ghana. I was born in a house with no running water, but my grandmother had a cell phone there before I did here, right? And if most people I talk to in the U.S., they think about Africa and they think, oh yeah, Africa's struggling, just trying to make it happen. You know, proud though, Ungawa. And what they miss is the opportunities that is there. So when we look at all the businessmen and the entrepreneurs and the political figures indeed that come to see us, they're typically Chinese. We have folks coming in from Latin America as well. We have a relative dearth of Black Americans coming in, but there's a natural possible synergy there. I'll give you one more example and then I'll pass the mic. You know, I was doing a project in Jamaica recently with a young man who was working on how do you get young people learning? He's a math teacher. He's like, how do you teach kids better? And he decided he's going to start a robotics program because learning robotics could be really useful for these kids. And he did it. But it was interesting the way he did it. He worked with any student that wanted to participate, but he created a number of scholarships for kids in the worst ghettos of Kingston. Now, to put it in context, the year they started was, I think, 2005. Jamaica had the highest murder rate on the planet. Worse than Iraq, worse than Afghanistan, worse than Camden, worse than Gary, you name it, they beat it. In the time I went, I think I was going once a month for about 3 or 4 months. Virtually every trip, somebody I knew had already been killed a month later. It's insane. This guy taught these kids who everyone presumed couldn't learn to read, oh, they're the dregs of society. He taught them advanced robotics and programming such that they now compete at global competitions for this sort of, you know, Lego-style programming where you can get affordable robotics and build on them. And it helps to expand the mind of what's possible. So what I'd love to inject into the conversation is some thinking around how we can learn from our Black communities globally and how we can think about ourselves from the position that to some degree we already are empowered, particularly as compared to some of the issues facing some of our brethren around the world. And how do we leverage that power to create more?
Well done. Thank you very much for those wonderful comments, and we'll return to that when we go to the discussion. Now I'd like to introduce to you Melanie Campbell, who's joining us, President and CEO of the National Coalition of Black Civic Participation and convener of the Black Women's Roundtable Intergenerational Public Policy Network. Ms. Campbell.
Thank you. How's everyone? Thank you. Thank you, Elsie. Thank you all for this opportunity to dialogue. When I think of the word empowerment, I look at it from this lens of self-determination, the ability for our communities, not singular but plural, to leverage our political power to a level of moving our agendas that benefit our community. And not just for those of us who are sitting in the room, but leveraging it with a longer vision about 20 years out, 30 years out, 10 years out. One of the things we know, Donna, Katrina, right? There were people who had plans on the shelf who, as soon as they had a political moment to use it, they use it for their benefit and not for the benefit of those in the community. I think we're at one of those empowerment moments in the next 47 days. And that is the agenda that we know we need that is about equity or opportunity will be impacted by this election for 20 years, 30 years, 10 years to present. So being able to not let the noise get in the way of knowing that collective power is also individual power. The ability at this point with this election, and I can't help but, you know, we're just so in the midst of it, I can't get away from it. Knowing, we were talking yesterday, we had the Black Women's Roundtable Power to Sister Vote Forum, the fourth one we've had at the caucus. And the reason that room was standing room only is because we are, through the CBCF partnership, allowing ourselves to say it's okay to even say we have power. The question we really were grappling with is how to maximize that power to engage our agenda so we have the results we need, whether it be about the jobs, whether it be about healthcare, whether it be about better quality education, whatever those issues are. And knowing what the power of Black women, the power of young people, in the vote. Really, I think about Dr. Walters, who always, the late Dr. Ron Walters, who can't ever forget to inject into a conversation about empowerment, is being okay. It's okay to talk about Black empowerment. Because folks talk about Latino empowerment. They talk about Asian American Pacific Islander empowerment. They may even talk about African empowerment, you know. And the reality is that part of what's happened, when you talk about the conversation, sister talk about race, is that if you say Black, oh, you're injecting the race card. I remember Elsie saying this in the initial conversation around the pushback on the Affordable Care Act that has now been deemed Obamacare. She said, we need to take that, and she's not in the room, but y'all tell her what she said in a room of Black quote-unquote leaders, many of us who call ourselves leaders, that we need to take the word back and make it a positive word. Now you hear people saying Obama cares. Being able to be strategic in the language, being able to take back an argument so that we can move our political agenda. And so that's kind of some of the thoughts I have around empowerment. I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And now we're going to move to our prized moderator from this morning, Dr. Marc Lamont Hill. Let's give him a round of applause for his great job this morning. And you can share with us your comments too, which will be interesting. And you, I sort of see you as, you sort of ride the fine line of academia as a professor at Columbia, but are also, highly invested in sort of speaking truth to power in the policy world. And so how do you see this being a political commentator? How do you see the ideas of Black progress, Black equity and power, just issues that, policy issues affecting Black people, that sort of conversation happening?
Well, I think that's a good question. I mean, they said all the good stuff already. They don't like being fifth. But I think, wow, there's so many things to think about. I think, when I think about empowerment in its truest sense, one of my concerns is, again, as Donna said, leveraging the resources we have to demand from institutions what we're entitled to. I think too often the conversation when it comes to Black folk becomes a conversation where we're thinking about what we can get the government to give us. Right? That's how the right certainly wants it to be framed, that we are that 47% of Americans, to use Mitt's numerology, that 47% of folk who are lazy, who are entitled to things that don't belong to them. And we can almost buy into that conversation as opposed to thinking about ourselves as the very beings who built America, as the people who are entitled to all of America's democratic promise. I think when we think about it in that way, we're on the road to empowerment, so that we think what the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, I don't like to use language owes us something, but we should be the legatees of what they offer. I think that's difficult to do, that empowerment move in the age of Obama, because I think Black folk are often trying to walk that tightrope of offering principled critique of the president at the same time that they understand that that principled critique would be leveraged against us and him in ways that would undermine his movement, undermine his presidency, and ultimately maybe lead to the emergence of another force like Mitt Romney, like John McCain, which would be the exact opposite of what we need. So I think we're always struggling with that. I'm fascinated by Melanie's book. The subtitle of it is Black Nationalism and African American Public Opinion, because whenever I see Black public opinion polls, and it says Black people approve of President Obama at 95%. I'm like, it's not like Black folk don't have a critique of, it's not like only 5% of Black people have a critique of the president. It's not like only 5% of Black people are thinking about that, but that number is a proxy for something else. In a sense, we're trying to close ranks around race. We're trying to make sense of a world that is constantly trying to undermine a progressive Black agenda and using the president as a vehicle for that kind of move. So I think it's complex to even have an empowerment conversation, because I think it's always being politicized and used in ways that we may not anticipate or want. That said, I think that Black empowerment starts at the place where we don't completely allow other people to define our reality. When you talk about power, power is the ability to define other people's reality, to tell them what matters. And I think too often we are told what matters. 4 or 8 years ago, I can't tell you how many Black people I know voted for George Bush. And part of why they voted for George Bush was because they were told that George Bush had the right politics around moral issues. But they told us what the moral issues were. So they said, well, moral issues are stem cell research. Because I'm from North Philly. I ain't met a Negro in North Philly yet that cares about stem cell research. I'm not saying we shouldn't, But I find it hard to imagine that's our priority issue. They said stem cell research, abortion, and gay marriage were the 3 primary moral issues of our day. That we allowed someone to define what we cared about and to help define even what our moral agenda was, such that we didn't talk about the fact that we were mass incarcerated. We didn't talk about the fact that we were in broken schools. We didn't talk about the fact that we didn't have access to food and healthcare and housing. And we didn't frame them as moral issues because someone else told us that those other 3 issues, which are important, and I work on behalf of all those issues, but they told us that those were the moral issues. So we allow other people to define our reality. I think as long as we do that, we have a problem. I think part of why we allow other people to define our reality is because Black folk as a community are still obsessed with the white gaze, G-A-Z-E. We're still obsessed with how we look in public to white people. And that doesn't just govern our everyday cultural practice. I'm an anthropologist by training, so I think about how our everyday cultural practices go. You know, like my grandma would say, don't eat watermelon in public, that kind of stuff. You know what I mean? You at work, you know you want the chicken, but you reach for the fish anyway just because. That's a certain kind of cultural move we make that's governed by what someone called the politics of respectability, wanting to look respectable, but it also defines how we approach our politics. It defines how we approach our activism. It defines how we decide what matters in our communities and what does not. It even shapes how we respond to the president. So for me, part of what empowerment is not completely denying the fact that we will be measured against the stick of another, but to not become so obsessed with that kind of as Du Bois would say, two-ness, that we become prisoner to someone else's perception of us. Because you can never be empowered if your unit of measurement is someone else. So I think that becomes a key thing. And lastly, I think that we have to walk that tightrope between demanding what we are entitled as citizens of this nation, saying we built this thing, and having a very pragmatic, very calculated, very present understanding of the fact that Black folk have never really been able to achieve any kind of significant gains unless we organized internally, unless we did certain work ourselves. So at the same time that we need to demand subsidies for better food, because we have food deserts, right? I mean, you talk about Black empowerment. I mean, a great index of our lack of empowerment is food. We live in neighborhoods where we have to go 3 and 4 and 5 and 10 miles to get fresh fruit and vegetables. I mean, how disempowered can you be when you can't even eat food that will allow you to sustain a healthy life? And yes, that means that part of our activism has to be that. It's to frame that as a moral issue. Part of that means that we have to organize politically so that the Democratic Party doesn't take that for granted, doesn't take us for granted. Part of that means that we need to demand from the government that, yeah, we need subsidies. We need to create space so that people can build farmers markets, so that people can develop real estate, so that the only time, a Whole Foods comes to our neighborhood isn't when white folk move in. Because that's basically how it seems to work right now. You call it Starbucks like the white man's flag, in our neighborhoods. Whole Foods is right there in line too. There has to be a way for our neighborhoods to have healthy food options even when white folk aren't there, especially when white folk aren't there. But that also means that we ourselves have to be empowered enough internally that we build community gardens, that we begin to use what we have at our disposal irrespective of what we have access to from the government. So to me, empowerment is about that. It's about organizing politically, developing a kind of nationalist vision, but never losing sight of our citizenship. And if we can do those things, I think we can begin to move forward.
Dr. Hill, appreciate those comments. Definitely speaking to the issue of good quality health, not just access to good quality health care, but the fact that first and foremost, we have to have good health in order to be able to address these other issues. Thank you for your comments. And now we're going to turn to Dr. Henderson, who not only was somebody who was on the ground in Detroit doing grassroots political activism 20-some years ago, but was also a student of the late Dr. Ron Walters, and is now a professor. If you don't mind me sharing, Errol, we had been having some conversations about this panel, and he asked me, why are we calling it Black empowerment? Because it used to be called Black power. So there's something in the way we have these kinds of conversations that we might want to look at semantics, and if that is sort of a signal for something else deeper concerning the way we actually converse about this issue. So, Dr. Henderson, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I want to thank Dr. Menna Demessie for organizing this panel. And what Sister Elsa said before about what Menna was doing, recording some of the the panels, the participants at the National Council of Black Political Sciences, among other things. Menna was doing these things while she was on crutches. She was videotaping, and she has just an indomitable spirit. It's a pleasure meeting your parents. But thank you so much for inviting me, Dr. Menna Demessie. I appreciate that. When we talk about power, and Menna is right, I think empowerment is what we call black power when we don't want to offend the sensibilities of white folks. Because we used to call it black power, and that's what it was. Just like Sister said, we talk about black self-determination and self-determination in the political sphere. A lot of what more of us should do is demystify this stuff. Power is nothing but relative capabilities, that's all. Don't confuse power with influence. Influence is your ability to use that power to realize the ends you seek. But power is just relative capabilities, and we have those. The question is, what do we use them and toward what end? Just like brothers and sisters here have said. But it's so important that we demystify much of this. Much of our power is hidden in plain sight. And I want to say something when I have this opportunity, because so many people have said things that are right on point, but about things that are hidden in plain sight. We often don't see the power in front of us and then not make that, just like brother said, part of the national agenda, because so many times we're in a hurry to recreate the civil rights movement and to recreate it in the terms of the 1960s, when the conditions are radically different. We don't understand, too often we don't understand the 2000s because we didn't study the 80s. And we lived through it, that don't mean you studied and understood it. You see, from the 1980s, you go from the killing of Yusuf Bell in Atlanta to Yusuf Hawkins in New York. This transformation occurs in the 80s. Why does Reagan go to Philadelphia, Mississippi to announce his candidacy, but organize, have the Republicans in Detroit in 1980? And I'm from Detroit, from the Brewster Projects, the east side of Detroit. I said, how does this happen? What was the transformation that happened in the 80s? Because most of the folks today don't learn the 60s from their mothers and fathers. They learn the 60s through the 80s and their nieces, their uncles and their aunties, and just vicariously. I'm not saying you don't keep learning, you got to, but you got to see what is siphoned through. And too often we don't do enough of that. Notice I say we don't, some of us don't. And this goes to the we. Sisters and brothers, let me give you an example. In 1987, sisters organized what became the modern urban peace and justice movement. Sister Clementine Barfield in Detroit in 1987, after her son was murdered, 17-year-old son was murdered. She built in the bloodshed of her son an organization called Save Our Sons and Daughters. It became a blueprint that Sister Brenda Muhammad used in Atlanta, Mother's Rock used in LA. Brothers and sisters, most of them women, organized to bring peace to our community. It was the first push toward orientation in hip hop toward peace and stop the violence. If you remember that, the 1980s, right? So long ago. This organization built, it spread for 15 years. It laid the basis for the modern Urban Peace and Justice Summit. It laid the basis for the gang summits. It's as real and it's as powerful as it is ignored. So when I see people today talking about what we do in Detroit, what do we do in Philly, what do we do in Chicago, what do we do in these places with so much gun violence, and here you have a blueprint from this sister who organized this, built that for 15 years. It's as important as it is ignored. So it's important for us to demystify these things and not to think there's just only one way to do this. There's many ways. So if we're talking about organizing the communities, that don't make you the super ultimate brother or sister. They're organized to vote as well. But we should have an agenda, and we do, many of our communities, and sisters right, our vast communities, but our agenda should go from voting to reparations. It's no mystery, and it didn't just fade away when Du Bois died, that the main reason we still suffer under conditions here of this gross inequality because we never realized the land gains that were owed us after enslavement. It's just clear. It's plain. It's as plain as it is getting quiet. Our agenda should range from voting to reparations. See? So when we talk about this, and we should have many agendas, we should be careful and patient with each other. We'll talk about how many of us are miseducated. We meet each other and we immediately want to argue. See, instead of saying, I'm going to be patient with my brother, patient with my sister, get to understand their different perspectives, and do what I need to do locally and have that build up, instead of chasing every last hurricane and tornado and trying to make a movement out of it. I don't mean you will go to people where they are and when they're in need, but you don't have to go there and reject the conditions you see in order to impose something from outside. And what happens is we lose the local initiative, and that's what happened to the Urban Peace and Justice Summit. Too quickly, they wanted to make a national movement, and national leaders came in and swept it away. undermined many of the local initiatives, and what was left? Us organizing on the ground, in the housing projects and throughout, and we're still there. The Interrupters in Chicago are still doing that. The brothers and sisters operating out of Fellowship Chapel and on the west side of Detroit are doing that. Organizing the communities, these local initiatives. We need to let people see that they are exercising their power and to help them turn it into influence, but they're doing it each day. The challenge for many of us is to put it on these agendas, say the names of those folks you know who are doing things before we start talking about what nobody's doing and ain't nobody this. And that's what Toni K. Bambara meant when she said too quickly, we're often too ready to believe the ugliest about each other instead of the beauty, the wonderful, wonderful traditions that we're built in and grounded in. And the last thing, we need to say something about the people who are victims of the crimes in our community. Listen to me now. Malcolm X said, it's not a shame to have been a criminal, but it's a shame to remain one. I get so tired of folks talking about criminals as if they just returning from Paris. They're returning to our community. Many of them been put in jail by the same people in the same community that they preyed on. And I'm from a housing project in the east side of Detroit. Listen, but I've been organizing in prison since I was a teenager. So I know everybody in prison ain't Geronimo Pratt. It's not Sekou Odinga, it's not Mutulu Shakur. You see what I'm saying? But we have people out here that walk in wounded, who've been victimized, many of them women, many of them children, a lot of them black boys. And we need to speak to them as well. The value of them. It doesn't just matter. Your value does, your black life doesn't only matter when a white person takes it. All these lessons we have, but a lot of it is hidden in plain sight. We know what power is. That's why we call it empowerment. Because we know what happened when we call it black power.
Thank you, Dr. Henderson. I was going to go to Melanie Campbell because she's giving high fives, and we're talking about this blueprint. I want to turn to you of our history. And, thankfully, I get to hear Dr. Henderson and Dr. Price at our annual conference talk about these issues in detail, and it helps someone like me make sure that we know our history, because that's key. Otherwise, you're just reinventing the wheel, and we're, where we don't move, right? We're kind of stationed where we are, static. So given the work you've been doing on the ground, and you have a long history of grassroots activism and through the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation, what is this blueprint he's talking about? What works, what doesn't? What are we missing in this conversation?
All right. Excuse me. I think you really laid it out. And I think, and especially it was like several things clicking. Even when he mentioned the word reparations, we go, ooh, what? And sitting here with the brother saying, 2001 World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa. I was blessed to be there with the Black Leadership Forum and the late Reverend James Orange and the Congressional Black Caucus, and all of us were there when the current administration at that time, Bush, who they just dismissed it and also tried to put a wedge between those of us with African American or Black American, or whatever we want to call ourselves today, and our brothers and sisters on the continent, and to put a wedge in the idea of even talking about reparations. And pre 9/11, because it happened the week before when it ended, and we found a way to break through that. And I remember coming back from that trip, and Donna Yvonne Scruggs-Leftwich, Dr. Yvonne Scruggs-Leftwich hosted a press conference at the Press Club where we were talking about the fact that we had found a way to connect and get past the threats that the leaders were getting from our country to not even allow for the conversation to get real about global reparations and connecting across the diaspora around the issue of reparations. And that conversation really was going to go someplace else, and then 9/11 hit a couple of days later. And from, not that there's not a reparations movement, there are people who've been doing it for much longer, even than my being on this earth, and many of us. But that conversation ended there. And part of what I hope is that we find a way to bring that back in that conversation and get more strategic about it. I be no expert on reparations, but understand that that has a much broader
effect on having a blueprint, if you will, of connecting our diaspora in a way that we're able to move from a global perspective, because we are in a global world, but yet we've not fully tapped what that means for our communities. You mentioned the things that can happen, the things that you know are going on in our motherland, right? So I think part of it is, in the short order, we work in silos in our community when we're talking about power or empowerment movements, and we've got to connect that more in a real way. Folks who are working on global issues or Africa, over here. You know, the folks that's working on civil rights, you know, and I guess I fit in that category these days, over here. The folks who are working on economic empowerment are over here. There is a need for there to be real connectedness that's more strategic, in my opinion. Part of my daily frustration that I try to work through every day is you say you do what you can do, but that's with a we connected, and be meaningful about moving the we. There is no part of what I see in our Black leadership, and this is no disparaging of anybody, is that we've gotten into a generational thought that all I need is for me to do this over here, and then, so-and-so you got that, and so-and-so you got that over there, and so-and-so you got that over there. Not understanding we need to be strategically in a room and spending the kind of strategic thinking time that we need to move our agendas forward. And so if we're going to have a real blueprint, I say, one, it has to be global. And two, we have to be unified in a real way that we can move a broader agendas forward. And I'll stop there.
Okay. Before I bring Ms. Brazile and Dr. Hill into the conversation, I want to turn to Derrick on this question of looking at Black empowerment on a more global perspective. And as someone who was born and raised in Cleveland, although my parents are from Ethiopia, there's all multiple identities of Blackness that I share. And so when you look at statistics, for instance, of with regard to education, right? You look at the numbers and you think, oh, of course, Asians are the highest foreign-born educated population in the U.S., when in fact Africans are right up there with them. Now, we all share phenotypically race, right? But that interconnectedness we had in the 60s that Dr. Henderson alluded to, have we missed that? How do we re-engage the diaspora, African Americans here, and Black people abroad?
And a very powerful question, and I'm trying to avoid taking a political angle on some of this stuff, because there are people here much better qualified to speak to that aspect than me. But I will say, from a historical perspective, I would argue one of the problems that we have as a community is that it seems the civil rights movement came into a mode where it fought so hard for integration as opposed to desegregation. And I see these as two very separate things. Integration is, this is what's out there, this is what's good, we want to be a part of that. Desegregation, to my mind, is these are barriers that are unfairly imposed upon our community. We want to break those down. And the reason I mention that is because, to some degree, in a segregated America, and I'm not saying it's better or we should be there or what have you, but when you look at what happened, let's say, in the U.S. as opposed to Brazil, in the U.S. where we had this hardcore segregation, whereas in Brazil it depended on your color and your shade and how much cash you had, we had to build independent institutions. We had to find ways to identify with ourselves. And a lot of the civil rights movement was also connected to and related to the African liberation movement, which started in the 1950s. So part of why I think we no longer think of ourselves as like a global community is because a lot of us don't have to, right? We've been integrated. We're here right now. You know what I'm saying? And it's because you're not standing outside anymore, you don't have to look to see who else is out there that you can build a team with. Being in the room is good, but it comes back to that same issue of, do we see where our power is? I've been tweeting some of the things I've been said, and one comment that came back to me is like, well, the Black communities globally are multifaceted in nature. This makes it very difficult to identify. I can guarantee you that there is no greater difficulty for a Black American to connect with a West African, for example, than there is for somebody from Shanghai or Beijing. Now, my godmother is Chinese. Chinese being in West Africa ain't nothing new. She was there, decades ago. But what is happening now is people are looking and they say, hey, I see opportunity. I see something can be built here. I don't speak your language. I don't know your culture, but let's work this out. And that happens all around the world. And yet we have this idea that, well, we ain't all exactly quite the same. And this goes for Africans too. Africans come here and they're like, oh, well, these African Americans, I don't know about all that. They believe the same hype that we believe about ourselves. Right? And so we don't build the connections that we ought to. So part of what I think is so crucial and what I will emphasize as much as possible is there's already a lot of advancement that has been made. I mean, and I'm not just talking about Obama is president. I mean, black people are in a different place today than they were 50 years ago, period. Some things are better, but are worse, but a lot of things are better. So how do you identify what you've got and figure out how you build on that in a collaborative fashion? I was in Silicon Valley a couple of months ago, and I'm looking around, and there are venture capitalists out there that are, quiet as kept, trying to find black-led projects to invest in. Because it looks so bad that there's like one black guy that everybody talks about when they talk about Silicon Valley, Tristan Walker. Now, meanwhile, a bunch of my friends, cats who grew up out here and in London and Berlin and whatnot, who went to MIT and Stanford and Caltech, have gone back to Ghana and Nigeria and Kenya. In East Africa, they've got this whole Silicon Savannah building up. And these dudes are building engineering companies. And I'm like, wait a minute. You know that you right here, it doesn't cost the same amount to build a tech company in Africa as it does here. That a coalition of African American investors for a certain amount of capital could be building billions of dollars in value on the continent and investing over here and thinking vice versa. I'm not talking about charity and I'm not talking about cultural exchange. I'm talking about enterprise and entrepreneurship and the opportunity to build a kind of power that the whole world understands. The kind of power that the Chinese come in and they say, I'm gonna learn Yoruba and we're gonna talk some English and you're gonna hit me up with a little bit of Cantonese right now so that we get this done. There's no reason we shouldn't be a part of that game and creating the kind of economic empowerment that can enable us to figure out what and where we think our resources need to be applied and to frankly have the leverage when it comes to having conversations about things like reparations.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Speaking of leverage, which was one of Dr. Walter's sort of key, this idea of how do we leverage black empowerment in ways that we can engage with the electorate, I want to turn to Ms. Brazile. Now, the numbers we know don't lie. As a result of the 2008 elections, we know more people went to the polls than ever before, upwards of 130 million people. From 2004 to 2008, there were 5 more million voters to the polls, and of those 5 million, 2 million were black, 2 million were Hispanic, 600,000 Asian, right? And the numbers show that there's something about the President Obama that's inspiring people to become more civically engaged. So the question to you is, do you feel that voting, what else do we need to do in terms of there's sort of voting, and obviously there's challenges to how we even discuss that issue as a result of, even today's earlier conversation. How do you see black people using the vote in ways to give rise to these many issues we're discussing?
Well, again, I go back to this notion that we just can't show up on election day and expect things to happen overnight and to transform the country. Dr. King's last book was Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos Our Community. And in that book, Dr. King laid out this framework that we're now faced with the fact that tomorrow's today, we are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. Dr. King outlines some of the things that we should be focusing on in these so-called difficult days, which I still believe we're in. And he said the next phase of our movement would bring us closer to dealing with these challenges. Demand better jobs, higher wages, decent housing, education, and a guarantee of the rights won in 1964 and 1965. If you think about what's happening to, I believe, black politics in America today is that we've been playing defense when we should be playing offense. We played defense in 2010 with the rise of the Tea Party Republicans across the country, having to go back and relitigate practically all of success and gains that we've made over the last 10 to 15 years. We're playing defense as it relates to public policy, monetary policy, tax policies. I mean, we're still debating whether or not the Reagan tax cuts of the 1980s, the trickle-down notion, trickled to any of us in this room and many of the friends and family members we know outside this room. And the fact is that has led us to the greatest redistribution of wealth in American history. So I think what we have to focus on today, going into this election season, is where do we go from here? What are we going to fight for? What is the agenda? And we should all be on the same page. I think we've lost a sense of community. I mean, all over this country, and I think I travel a great deal, there's no sense of community anymore. People are hanging out on this corner, focusing on this set of issues, and then you have another group of people hanging out on this corner, focusing on this subset of issues. The other day on CNN, someone posed a question, well, there's a group of ministers who are telling people they shouldn't vote. I said, who the hell are those people? Are they, what religion? I couldn't believe it. I've never heard anything like that in my life. And yet, that was a topic. So I really do believe that we need to amplify the voices that are out there in the community. We need to identify those emerging leaders. And Melanie and I go back for almost 25, 30 years. I started in this city when I was 21. I'm 52. I make no bones about the fact that this whole body is getting tired, but I refuse to get off the playing field until we have enough reinforcements out there who will continue this battle for civil rights and women's equality and all of the other rights that we should have as Americans, because I will continue to work for a more perfect union. But we need to empower the next generation. And let me just say this, because I think I'm old enough. May not be the oldest person. Well, if I am, God bless you. But when I was 21, when I first came to Washington, D.C. 30 years ago this month, Coretta Scott King and Stevie Wonder and Dorothy Height and Jesse Jackson, all the others, didn't come and anoint me. I went into the room, sat down, brought in a folding chair and said, I want to help make Dr. King's birthday a holiday. I stayed there long enough. They didn't pay us. Walter Funtroy didn't pay. They used to promise us that they would pay us on Friday, remember? And they didn't ever pay you on Friday. But what they paid us was they gave us a way in to help. When we started organizing the Free Nelson Mandela, Ronald Reagan was president. We didn't care. We went out there and we organized. We marched. Some people got arrested. We went back out there and we marched. And we didn't care. We knew it was morally right. We've lost that compass to do what is morally right. We should be protesting every day that there are people on Capitol Hill who want to not only take away our voting rights, but they want to take away Pell Grants. They want to take away Medicaid funding in the states. I don't understand. I mean, I want to go home to Louisiana and march on the state capitol once they clean up from Hurricane Isaac, because every time I hear that my governor may not allow people who are on Medicaid to continue to get the health care they deserve, it makes me mad, and I want to go out there and organize again. So we have to find ways to keep a community that will show up at the polls, energized and actively engaged. The moment we leave the poll in place and go home and go back to our little comfortable lives, we lose the argument. We've given up our power. No, we've outsourced our power to someone else, and we've left the table. When you vote, I'm going to tell you something. When George Bush was appointed president in 2001, I didn't care. I harassed them. And the day after Hurricane Katrina made landfall, I called him and I said, do you need a translator? You need somebody to help you? And I stuck my finger and my face in the door. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we can never, ever stop organizing and stop fighting for justice and equality. This struggle will never go away. I pray that this old 52-year-old body didn't have to go to 40 states already this year. Some states multiple times saying the same thing. But you know what? I know that if we don't go out there and organize, people will forget what's at stake. And it's not just the presidency of the United States, ladies and gentlemen. It's 33 members of the United States Senate. It's all 435 members of the United States Congress. And so that's what's on the ballot. I sat here and started going from 1972 all the way to 2008. And every step along the way, we made progress. President Obama, and I'm going to say it up front, anybody disagree with me, I want to see you right now. President Obama would never have made it into the White House had we not started organizing, had we not started doing voter registration campaigns, had we not demanded the right to vote and went out there and exercised our right to vote, got people out, David Dinkins, Harold Washington, I don't have to name all of the names. You all know we've made history every step along the way. And you know what? Despite all of the attempts to try to block us, to force us to bring multiple forms of ID, you know what? You ready for this? Because I know. Anybody else run a presidential campaign in here? Anybody else worked on 7, 58 congressional, 19 state and local, 48 states? I have. They can't beat us. We have the numbers, but we got to go out and vote. We have the numbers, but we have to go out and vote.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to turn to Dr. Hill and talk to you about this idea of the discussion regarding racial politics in the presidency. I mean, you've had an opportunity often to interview folks on both sides of the aisle. And I just have a pretty pointed question. Is racism alive and well here in terms of the strategy used by the opposition, or is it purely party politics at its best? Is your mic on?
It's racism.
Okay. Well.
Oh, okay. I might keep going.
You can talk more about it if you want.
I think that I think it's both and. I think the Republican Party's politics are driven by racism. I mean, I think that's obvious. Donna Brazile just said we have the numbers. I mean, the reality is we always had the numbers. Well, maybe not always, but we typically have the numbers. Republicans, at least in the last few elections, have not won because they made a compelling argument to the American people. They didn't win because we stayed home even. They win by the margin of votes they can suppress. They win by the margin of young people and poor people and black people and brown people that don't vote. They don't win by genius, as Jesse Jackson used to say. You know, they win by default. And so to me, the politics that animates that kind of political move is one of racism. It really is. I mean, I was stunned today as I was moderating the panel as the woman talked about how she didn't see the racial dimension of a policy that on its face disenfranchises almost exclusively black people. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's axiomatic, it's self-evident. By definition, it's a racial policy because it's affecting people of one race. Mm-hmm. And they all are black. They all are brown, or nearly all black, or nearly all brown, I should say. It's a racial policy, but it goes beyond that. It goes beyond just the politics of what happens when we go in the voting booths. It also is about the entire Republican Party's sort of moral calculus around the political calculus. When you think about over the last 4 to 6 years, the way in which they have managed to strip away all of the public good in favor of the private interest. How have they done that? Well, they've recoded the public in racial and class terms. So that when we think about public, we think about poor black people. When you think about public housing, we don't think about subsidies for middle-class white folk to move to the suburbs. We think about the Taylor homes. We think about Cabrini Green. We think about the Richard Allen projects in Philadelphia. We think about certain kinds of public housing. When, Melanie, you talk about the welfare queen, we're reimagining the welfare queen. We give her new names like baby mama and this, that, and the third, but basically we're still talking about the poor black woman who's exploiting the public good for her own interest. That's the narrative. And it's but the numbers don't change. White people are still primarily receiving welfare. Most people on welfare are white, female, and young. That's still the case. But they can change our public imagination in such a way that poor white people vote against welfare because they think they're voting against precious. I mean, really. That stuff ain't a coincidence. So whether it's public housing, whether it's public schooling, whether it's public transportation, whether it's public assistance, whether it's public options in healthcare, they have coded all of those things in racial terms so that the people who need them the most want them the least, because in the same way that you have to whiten the face of poverty to make it real, you can darken the face of poverty to make it marginal. And that's exactly what they have done. And that's why it's so important to me, in light of the other point you made, which is that black folk were civically engaged in 2008. I'm not convinced we were. I'm not convinced that we were. I'm convinced that we voted. Mm-hmm. But but when I look at what happened in 2010, I become not cynical, but somewhat less hopeful that we were politically engaged. That didn't seem like a political movement as much as it felt like a fan club. Because it seemed to me that in 2010, the stakes were just as high, maybe even higher. 2012, they're even higher. And I need to be convinced that we're going to go out there and do what we need to do, because those stakes around housing, around healthcare, around food, around education, those things have not changed. So we need to do, that's the work I think that needs to be done. That means we need to push back against the kind of petty racial politics that have allowed those tactics to be deployed, that have allowed those kind of policies to emerge, and even on their face in the most overt way. Because again, I'm glad y'all said this. It's not just this subtle, complicated Rockefeller drug law, crack, powder cocaine. I mean, that stuff is certainly racial, but it's also people standing on national television talking about you people. It's also about screaming, "You lied to a president." It's also about people in a press briefing blatantly disrespecting a sitting president of the United States. I mean, there's so much stuff. The air is so, the Tea Party, literally using colonial imagery to harken back to a time, a good old days that weren't so good for poor people and black people and women and so forth, and gays and lesbians and so forth and so on. The air is so thick with racism that's so overt that I don't even think we have to dig that deeply to find it. So for me, that's why we need to organize and do the work that's being done today, and that's going to be done hopefully through November 6th so that we can win this election.
Great. I want to
Can I say one more thing, because I'm going to leave early?
Sure.
Not because I have back to school night in Philly and I got to get back from my daughter, but the thing I think is also we can't fetishize the vote either. I agree that we don't want to deny the vote. We don't want to ignore the value of voting, because even if President Obama weren't on the ballot, those statewide elections we just talked about, those citywide elections matter. Even when we lose national elections, we still affect, Donna Brazile talked about David Dinkins. You can talk about, what's my man in Virginia, Wilder. I mean, part of how that happens is because we have a Jesse Jackson campaign, which she masterfully worked on, right? Jesse loses in 84, but Dinkins was in 85. You just said me lose in 88. Look what happens in 89 in Virginia. So it's important to think about all of that. So voting does matter, and I encourage everyone to get into those voting booths because the stakes are so high, but we cannot fetishize the vote either. We cannot assume that once we've voted, the work is done, because as someone said, the bulk of the victories we've had have not been because we went in the voting booths. That stuff was part of the equation, but it was really us hitting the ground and organizing on a grassroots level to make the change that we wanted. And that, to me, is a real political movement.
Thank you. Point well taken. And with Dr. Price, we can have you in the conversation. Let's give Dr. Hill a round of applause, since he will be taking off early. And just to let you know, folks, we will take questions from the audience. We have about half an hour to go, so I'd like to have some remaining comments made, and then we'll turn to you, and then we'll come back for a wrap-up as well. So go ahead, Dr. Price.
Sure. The first thing that I was thinking when Dr. Hill was talking is that one of the things that we never talk about is practically everybody who ran in the Republican primary lived in some kind of public housing. If it wasn't for Rick Santorum, whose father worked for the Veterans Administration, they lived on the place where they worked. If it wasn't for Mitt Romney, whose father was governor of Michigan, and they lived in the taxpayers' owned houses. If it wasn't for every one of them who went to a state colleges, that money is built with taxpayer money. That's all government housing. That's all publicly subsidized housing. And so every time they come up with these kinds of discussions, I think, what? You lived in public housing too. You told me your daddy and you and your cousin and your grandma, you all lived on the Veteran Affairs house that was provided. If you were in the military, you got publicly subsidized housing. But I think the thing that we also need to focus on about the importance of Barack Obama coming into office, and the thing that was so important about Jesse Jackson and other people coming up in the 1980s, and that is we should be thinking about not just Barack Obama, but who are the people who are going to ride the coattail of Barack Obama into politics? Who are the young people that are working on his campaign who are now going to run for school board, who are now going to run for city council, who are now going to eventually become mayor, right? What we should really be concerned about is not just whether or not we elect Barack Obama. I think as much as you watch Mitt Romney, you ought to be able to see that even if you can't stand the man, should happen. But even if we don't elect him, where is the generation of politicians that are coming after him? And if we don't see that kind of fruit, that's when you know that Marc Lamont Hill was right. It was a fan club and not a movement. And so I think we need to really think about how we're going to identify those people and how we're going to make those emerging leaders be the people who will carry this forward. When I teach classes on Black politics and social movements, we spend a lot of time on the civil rights movement. And one of the things that I spend a lot of time talking about is how it is not just a situation where all these people thought the same thing, had the same personality, sang the same song, and got together and did the same thing for the same goals. There was real conflict. There were people who had personality clashes. There were people who disagreed with things that happened. But the difference is they all stayed in the room and in the fight, right? So you can't say, oh, I'm young, I can't go to this NAACP meeting. These old people be working my nerves. They always want you to say, yes, ma'am. You always, it's a lot of things that we talk about that are intolerable about everyday politics that you have to sit through in order to have progress made. I'm sure Ms. Brazile could tell us about 1 million meetings where she had to sit through nonsense to get to the thing that was most important. And so I try to tell my students, look, it's not about unity, it's about community. Those are very different things. And so when I hear people say, oh, we just can't get together, we can't be unified, can you actually sit in the same room? That's the only thing you need to be able to do. Not actually agree on absolutely everything, but you have to be willing to say, at some point, I'm going to compromise in this moment, maybe I can get something I need down the line. And I think these are the kinds of ways that if we think about Black politics, that we're more likely to see action and more activity on the part of ordinary citizens.
Thank you. Dr. Henderson, I want to bring you into the conversation. So when we look at sort of the ways the younger generation is mobilized, I mean, even if you take a step back and look how young teenagers are now going to school with people from all walks of life. So it's the same fight in some ways, but not in others. We're inundated with all sorts of information in terms of, Twitter, Facebook. Honestly, the young generation doesn't have enough time to sort of sift through what's real, what's not, and where do they go from here. So when you look at the strategies of political engagement, Dr. Hill mentioned, voting is one type of civic participation, but not enough. The numbers still show folks with low income, folks with low educational attainment, minorities voted in significantly high numbers for President Obama. On the other hand, whether those policies they voted for have been actualized, we have sort of yet to see. And obviously, they believe they're headed in the right direction under President Obama. What strategies of engagement work for the new generation?
I think one thing is to stop telling these young folks, because they listen to Nicki Minaj, and we may listen to Lil Kim, and you may listen to Lola Falana, that they don't have, or watch the dance, but that they have some type of valueless orientation, or it's some kind of mystery. They just wasn't like the ones 20 years ago. Well, certain objective things change, to be sure, but often we disqualify ourselves from the conversation just from jump. Keep talking about how different they are. Imagine what your parents said about you when you were in your 20s. Maybe some of them still say that about you, You know what I'm saying? But we make these barriers even when they don't exist. The same way we do things like when sometimes when white racists are around and we change our discussion, we change our orientation. So I think part of it is just walking away from some of these nonsense notions, and that's one of them, that you have this generational divide that is any more significant than what it was before once you grant technology and things like that. So the other one is just having that direct access and stopping and talking to folks. The same things we've been doing since we got here. It's the one thing that strikes me. We have not faced anything like our ancestors faced. Nothing. And yet they laid a path for us and set up trails for us to later blaze through. Some of them they blazed through themselves. But we often act like the world was never so difficult as when it was blessed with our presence, But we often don't use it as a resource. Let me tell you something. It's almost like hearing some conversations, it's almost like black folks still the last folks on the planet waiting for white folks to act fair. So they use our image, they use the best image that we have, and they change it and then promote it to our children in ways that undermines. You have folks walking around saying Martin Luther King was a Republican. See, I don't answer that question. I walk away. Or if someone does ask me that question, I'm talking about in the media, raise the image and interest of those folks who are doing those things that we need in our communities. Raise Clementine Barfoot. I'm going to do it again. Raise Brenda Muhammad. Raise the Sisters and Brothers of Mother's Rock. Raise Marion Stamps. Raise these folks so people ask you, who are those people and what institutions are they building in our communities? Because I haven't heard of them. There's a reason why we haven't heard of them. See? So one of the things, and the same things to raise them to our children. We used to organize at Public Enemy concerts. So we'd organize. When we shut down the University of Michigan in '87, when we shut down Wayne State University for 11 days, dust off the old demands for a black studies department that the Panthers had made in the 60s, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers had made in the 60s, the RNA had made in the 60s, and built a department that still stands there to bring these young folks here because we're not tourists in their lives. You see? So the only message I have for young folks, the same message I have for old folks. You go to church, you got Sunday school. They don't give you a different Bible for the young folks. I mean, it's the same word. Rescue me if I'm help me. Let me. Yeah. So we say, so don't mystify it to start with. And I got to say this about King. His last public sermon, this was King's words, exactly. He said, it's an unhappy truth that racism is a way of life for the vast majority of white Americans. He didn't say a couple of them. He didn't say a little bit. He said the vast majority. He said a way of life. In his speech called Remaining Awake Through a Glorious Revolution. He don't even want you to participate, just remain awake. See? Racism is a way. Where did Martin say he found the most racist white folks? What did he say? What southern backwater was it? Right? Chicago, right? See? That's what he said. Cicero to be exact, right? So what we talk about, these institutions are set up. And when we talk about this, it's just like brothers and sisters have said. From voting to reparations, these agendas, and be patient with our people when they're talking about a different one. I teach international relations. I haven't raised one issue, and most of my research is on Africa. I haven't raised one issue about Africa yet, but we could, you see. But where we are, to talk about how we organize when we leave here, go back to these same places, build on what has worked. The trick is convincing us that there's nothing working. That's why I raised those images of Clementine Barfield, Brenda Muhammad, Marion Stamps, the Sisters and Brothers and Mothers of Rock. That's where the truth came from in LA. That's where the urban peace and justice came from. That's where the gang summits came from. Those women, they organized that. How did they do it? Most of them were building in the bloodshed of their own children. Look at the love and dedication of Miss Barfield. She said, my 17-year-old was killed. He was a victim, Derrick Barfield. Look at this. She said, so was the teenager who killed him. You see what I'm saying? That's Ms. Barfield. That's a Christian love that she builds and has that institution there. She caught all types of hell from a whole lot of folks, most of them men, a lot of them were preachers, but she had some good preachers too that organized with her, and she got young folks. She got the Detroit hip-hop community around her and supported her. There are examples here. The trick is teaching you that there's nothing there. There's no examples to fall back on. And to stop waiting for white folks or white supremacists or white racists to act fair. It gets my attention when the white racists act fair. I get suspicious about that, real uncomfortable.
Dr. Henderson.
There's an appearance of fairness. And I gotta say this, when we talk about especially with the major redistribution of wealth occurred in this country when the value of enslaved blacks was taken away from white folks in the South. It should have been put back into the blacks who were still there. I'm going, Menna. Okay, because Menna is probably the only person to get me to stop talking. I can stop.
Well, we'll return to it. It's just that Donna Brazile has to leave as well as Melanie Campbell, so I want to give them time to make some finishing remarks, and then we'll continue discussion and bring your questions in, Ms. Brazile. I just want to first of all say how much I appreciate listening to Dr. Henderson. I just finished cleaning my basement, and I feel like everything you've been talking about, I've been unearthing it. So thank you so much. Let me know if I could pass on some of my boxes. It's been a wonderful day here, and I got to go to my other job, which is CNN. This is my day on, because I guess Roland and Lamont are not available. I see they are not there, so of course they called the sister in. It's all right. We handle all of it. I love it, and it's a great pleasure to have both Lamont and Dr. Hill and Roland Martin as colleagues on CNN and Soledad and so many others. And that's another thing, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, one of the reasons why I'm out there on social media and the Twitterverse and all this other stuff is that we have to remain constantly informed and involved, listen to each other. I just follow Brother Sean. I follow Melanie already. Dr. Price, Dr. Henderson. I didn't see you guys on Twitter unless you have another little name.
I'm going to get one today.
All right,
I don't have it, but I'm
because Boo, I really do believe that your voices and what you're saying is powerful, and I like to, continue to maintain that contact. So I just wanted to. If you're on Facebook, I'll figure out how to friend you.
There you go.
But I want to make two last points, and one is. Throughout my entire life in politics, and like I said, I've worked in 48 states, and I feel no ways tired. And I mean, I've been involved at every level of politics. I've been in the room, outside the room, organizing to get in the room. I can tell you more political stories than you have time to listen over the next few hours. But this is one thing I have to say. Race is always going to be a subtext, undercurrent in American political life. It has been there for centuries. And so I try not to focus on the barriers because the barriers are enormous, especially when they erect barriers in the middle of the game, when you know here are all the rules that you need to apply to getting people out to vote or getting people registered to vote or getting people whatever, counting the vote, and then the rules are changing as we speak. And so that is part of this whole new revolution that we're seeing, the transformation in American politics, because as you all know, the transformation has happened demographically. I mean, we're at a period of time when pretty soon the two largest minority groups, African Americans and Latinos, will become the majority of voters in this country. And so we're at that stage where by 2022, if not before, we have a whole different electorate that will be out there casting their ballots. So this is something very important for young people in this room. And I want to tell you right now, pick your state, pick your elected position, and pick your time and start working on it today. Don't wait until, and first of all, don't wait for anybody to ask you. That is not the rules of engagement. If you want to run for office, if you want to be in the room, if you want to help make those decisions, well, go ahead and start deciding. Now, I decided when I heard Barbara Jordan give her keynote speech in 1976, I wrote in my diary, and I used to go straight to God, no offense to all my Catholic brethren, to my priests and my bishops and my archbishop. I said, dear God. And I said, I want to manage a presidential campaign by the age of 40. And in September of 1999, Al Gore asked me to run his campaign. I was already in the room. So, and I had already had enough campaigns under my belt. I want to say two last points. In 1986 and 1998, Melanie could tell you this, we defied the odds. Every time they said that we couldn't do it, we pulled it out. We pulled it out, meaning that we got more people out and we kept control of the Senate, or we returned control of the House of the Senate. So I just want to let everybody know about, again, back to the political capital is enormous. So my last notes. Since I'll be on ABC or CNN on election night, unless one of the brothers decide to show up for work, and let me rest my weary, you know what.
You have two of you at one time.
Well, you know how that goes too. That's a whole. I'll never forget. Roland and I were on TV one night, and we were like talking, and we were over, I guess, dominating. And then somebody started hitting us on the knee, and Roland and I we were almost at a fight. I said, "Damn, Roland." I guess because we kept looking at who hit us. We're like, "Shoot, watch that." But anyway, and let me, one day I'll tell y'all about being on TV with Tea Party Republicans. I respect everybody. And God knows I don't go out there looking for a fight, but that has been the most interesting, it's been the most interesting 2 years to get on TV with people who don't come to the room with any facts, with any information. It's all hatred and all negativity. And most of them don't even understand how to say President Barack Obama. So here's my last point. Missouri, Virginia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Florida, New York, Ohio, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, Nevada, African Americans make up more than 8% or higher of the electorate. And if you include the Hispanic community, you're talking about, when you talk about control of the Senate, 30 of the 33 states, I mean, okay, all right, so we're not in North Dakota, we're not in Montana, but we're in all the other states. And if we include Asian Americans, we're in Hawaii too. That is political power. That's building coalitions. That is focusing on how we leverage our power. This is our moment. We didn't finish the job in 2008. We started a new chapter. And when that chapter is over with, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to tell you, we will transform the face of American politics. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, we will have the power one day to put a woman in the White House. And when we determine who else we want on the Supreme Court, that is our right because we have that power. God bless you all, and go out there and fight.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brazile.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You better get your Twitter account.
I'm gonna get it. Thank you, Ms. Brazile. We appreciate it. At this time, we're going to turn to questions. I'll come down with that, Mike. In the meantime, though, I want to ask Dr. Price to kind of speak on in her book, Dreaming Blackness, which I encourage all of you to get. You talk to people on the ground, focus groups, African Americans, how they sort of situate themselves in their struggle for equity. And so, when do Black people say, I'm going to coalition build with others, and when do they say, I'm going to sort of look at within community intra versus intra? Yeah, you got it. Community engagement.
One of the things I want to say before that is it's a myth that Black people are not organized. They are very organized. The question is, what are they organized for, right? Black people are probably some of the most civically engaged. Why? Because Black people, more than any other population, still go to church more than most people. So you're all involved. You're all in an organization. So when people say Black people just need to organize, you are organized. There's probably not one person in here that's not in an organization. The question is, what are you organized for? Right? Or are you organized for your local line dance club? This exists because I know my mama goes to the Y every Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday to do it. Or are you local for your local, motorcycle club? Those people can also be engaged in political and civic engagement, right? Just because you're organized for some other activity doesn't mean that those groups can't also be transformed into political machines that are also doing work. One of the things I do is I like talking to regular citizens about what they think about politics. And my initial interest in my book was really, when do they decide to opt out of the American political system? And one of the things that I found, two things that I found that I think are really important to talk about here today. One of those is that there's some level of Black support that African Americans have universally. There are lots of people who support one or two, would you agree with me on this, Brother Errol? One or two tenets of Black nationalism. They think they should, shop in Black-owned stores. They believe Black children should be taught African-American cultural history, but they don't necessarily embrace all of them. One of the things that I found is that African Americans, when you ask them, I did an exercise where I asked them, if you could live in an all-Black America, what would that look like? Most of them said it would just be America, America, only with real equality. It would be America, America, where people had a fair shake. It would be the regular America, only where we weren't hobbled by racism, right? And so African Americans aren't sort of unique in the thing that they want from a country that they have worked in, built in, helped to create in the nation building process. They just want to say, hey, yeah, we participated in some of this. Why do we constantly have to then re-qualify ourselves for just basic recognition? And I think that's one of the things that we're seeing when you look at Barack Obama, right? One of the things that makes Black people so mad about people's refusal to call him President Obama, if you didn't call him President Obama, but you actually didn't just yell out at him in the well of the House, and you didn't interrupt him on the Rose Garden when nobody ever does that, people would be less angry. It's not just that you're not calling him Barack Obama, it's also the lack of respect. The thing that's very interesting is Mitt Romney's daddy ran for president. He was born in Mexico. John McCain ran for president. He was born in Panama, not on the canal, not on a Navy base, in actual Panama. Nobody ever asked them, hey, how is that going to actually work given the nature of the Constitution? Because we don't ask them whether or not they're when they talk about citizens, well, the thing that they're telling you is we don't want Black, brown, and Asian people. Because they don't ever ask white people are they citizens. And if most of the people I know in this country illegally are students who have overstayed their visa, and they are not Black. If you work at any university, you will come across them all the time, right? I can't go home because if I went home, I wouldn't be able to come back. Exactly. How many of us have heard that conversation? And so I think it's important for us to recognize, even when in race neutral terms, the things that they say that people are saying really are as racist as they can be without actually calling you the N-word. And I'm not too sure we ain't that close to that, given the political climate that's been happening the last year or so. No.
Okay, hi. And it's ironic, right? Because Mitt Romney, of all people, is the one to actually explicitly state that he was born in Michigan, but then say that it had nothing to do, then turn around.
Mitt Romney was born in Michigan. He lived in public housing. His daddy gave him a loan for his first house. He never had a student loan, never had to use a Pell Grant. Started his business, hasn't paid a tax rate over 15%. Probably ever. We don't know because we haven't seen him. This man has gotten more benefits of American citizenship than anybody you can imagine. And he doesn't want people who haven't been working for 4 years to get money to feed their kids.
Right.
That's the question you need to ask yourself. What more can he get? And what less can we have to make him happy?
Yes. All right, we have time remaining for questions, so what I'll do is look for you, if you can just raise your hand. We have a question here, and I'd ask if you could, state who you are, affiliation, but please keep your question short. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My name is Edwin Avent. I'm the former publisher of Heart and Soul magazine, building a new television network called the Soul of the South Network.
Oh, yeah.
Watch for it. Anyway, I have two questions or statements. One is, and Donna left before I got a chance to ask her, do we have any chance of winning the House back during this election? Or can we get enough seats back to take the majority? Because we know that when they took over the House, they shut President Obama down. So that's the first question. Then the next question I have is the issue of reparations in the age of Romney and Ryan. You know who he was talking about the other night when he talked about those people on the government who needs government money for everything. So they don't want us to have what is out there for everybody. And we're talking about getting reparations just for us when they won't even acknowledge, that we were slaves. They don't want us to have what everybody else can get right now. How likely is it that we can be successful in a reparations movement going forward? So can we get Congress back? How likely are we to be successful in a reparations movement?
Actually, you all can come up here.
One of the
It's
things that
probably
people are
faster
talking
that
about
way.
in relation to the House is that Mitt Romney, I don't know if that's on. Can you hear me?
Keep talking.
Okay, thank you. That Mitt Romney is actually being a drag on the lower part of the ticket, right? And so the lack of enthusiasm, and it is decreasing by the hour, that people have with him, the lack of support that he has is going to have a negative impact on every other Republican on the ticket, right? So that's why you see people like Linda McMahon in Connecticut and other people developing commercials saying, hey, we're not like Mitt Romney. We believe in the 47%, right? And so one of the beliefs is that the House can be taken back. It's going to be very close, but it can be done. And it was going to be more difficult had it not been for the work of our favorite Democratic campaigner, Mitt Romney, who seems to be creating a drag on his whole entire party. The thing I would say about reparations, and I'm then going to give this over to Errol, because he knows way more, Dr. Henderson, because he knows way more about this than I do, is I always tell people just because things seem improbable doesn't mean that you shouldn't keep working towards them, right? And so the first thing you tell some black people about, I work for reparations, they're like, you ain't going to never get that. It's a lot of slaves who weren't ever going to be free. Don't mean you shouldn't stop trying to escape. You think John Lewis thought, that he would ever be allowed to see a black president? He didn't stop walking, right? And so if the issue is on the side of right, then you should be working towards it, right? I think.
I appreciate what you asked. I suggest that black folks pursue multifaceted strategies and expand the agenda from voting to reparations. But to speak to reparations specifically, there's several strategies, and you can get in where you fit in. For the LDF, for the NAACP, to make affirmative action claims not based on the 14th Amendment, but the 13th Amendment, the redress against badges and incidents of slavery, so you can have a legal front in the Supreme Court. The issue of reparations is important because it's an issue of moral justice, of social justice, and it's the major unresolved issue of social justice in the United States, all right? So what you do is you expand the agenda. And whoever's in the White House today, are they George Wallace? You know what I'm saying? Do they look anything like Nathan Bedford Forrest? Think about the people who we've confronted, and if they're mysteries to you, well, you know George Wallace, Nathan Bedford, one of the founding members of the Ku Klux Klan, also a cavalry general in the Confederate States of America. What I'm saying is that our ancestors went up against folks and defeated 196,000 of us who served in the Civil War and fought for our freedom, 196,000 of us, including the 300,000 who served as laborers. These were just the fighting people. So much of controlling us is controlling our minds. So we often don't even think that we fought. We fought in the Civil, almost 200,000 of us, and it was only about 4 million of us in the country at the time, for our freedom. We saw whites were separate, and we allied with one group against another. This is the strategies that we use. If you read the strategies that our people have used and not just look at them as a reference, but as a resource, how did we do that? How did we build? And up against unimaginable odds, but not just to make unimaginable odds, but to expand the agenda for social justice. And when it comes down to just practical today, we know that this recession, the U.S. would have recovered from this recession if President Obama's policies that would have kept government workers would have been maintained. Right. The strategy to attack government workers is to attack them because we have an inordinate amount of black folks as government workers. If you expand this to reparations, this stuff falls in not as our number one priority, but this will be point F or G, but you can get point C or D out of that. And the C or D may be the government job. I'm saying we got strategies. We have ways that our ancestors use. And when I say ancestors, and people who are right here in this room, we can do this because we have been doing it. The trick is convincing us that we can't and convincing us that the power lies someplace else except with us. That's where I'm coming from with that.
All right, thanks. Let's get a question here.
It's not a question, it's actually a comment and a statement. My name is Clooney Lavash, and I'm assistant principal of a school from Brooklyn, New York. And we decided to motivate 50 young men to come down to this conference. And the idea is that through education outside of a four-wall classroom, these young men will become globally aware of what's going on against them and on their behalf, and hold their elected officials accountable so that they start to get into the movement to think about what's their position and place in the movement so that they are not just bystanders and think that they have no power. Brother Ashland said it best, they're global, and Brother Henderson also said it as well, that it takes small steps, and my job as an educator is really to educate them and find their own identity so that they start questioning society.
Exactly.
Thanks. You go ahead, Derrick.
I have a comment, but let's take one more question, and I want to speak to her as well.
Oh, okay. How you doing? Good afternoon. My name is Kwesi. I'm a CBC intern. And just really quick question. It's tied around hip hop and our contemporary culture. So I graduated from college. I'm a history major. Just to give you some context, the question is this: how did the society come that as young black people we've been made insecure to feel intelligent? The reason why I ask you that is because in current hip hop, there's this attitude of negativity. But fortunate for me, I left a place of negativity. I went to college, and I just learned a lot more. And I realized I didn't want to be like that anymore. You know, I didn't want to live that lifestyle. I like dressing like this. You know, I like looking a certain type of way. You know what I'm saying? I like reading, but that's not in our culture. But I know that as someone who studied history, there was a time when young black men at campuses, at the Howards, at the Hamptons did dress like this. You know, and it was accepted. It wasn't even weird. There was a time where you could read a book and it was fine. And for those older, like I said, I wasn't there. I wanted to know, how did that shift happen where young men dress like the way I used to? And I'm not even talking about the clothes because that's just a little thing. But I'm saying, how did that change happen? And maybe if you guys could, help with that.
Sure. Let's go to Derrick first on the first comment.
Yeah, I'll comment on both. First of all, thank you, sister. Wonderful to see you. When I first landed on these shores, I moved to East New York and then to Flatbush. So I went to PS 235. I was in the SOAR program. I went to Harvard for college. Every black kid I know from Flatbush who went to Harvard was in the SOAR program at PS 235, right? We all came out of a public school, and it just happened to be one that taught little black kids that we could. I left and I spent a lot of years overseas. I grew up in the Middle East, traveled around the world the whole night. I didn't come back to the States until my junior year of high school. And it was only then that somebody told me that black people are not supposed to be smart. I had no idea. No one had mentioned it. My parents weren't trying to hear that. And that mentality that I could be just as good and better than anyone else has served me so well. And I want to take that as the segue to answer Kwesi's question. My name is also Kwesi. Kwesi is male born on Sunday in the Akan culture. So I'm Derrick Nana Kwesi Abaka Ashang. So I see you there. I'm also an MC. And I came up in music before I got into technology and entrepreneurship in the whole nine. And I would say that one of the greatest disservices that has been done to our community and that we have allowed to be done to our community is we have allowed other people to define who we are and therefore define where we stand. First of all, if you're a black person right now in France or in Germany, you got it a lot worse than trying to be here in the United States. Your mommy and daddy, your grandpa could have been born in Berlin. You could speak German better than any German kid on the street. You would still be seen as Auslander, right? People will look at you and know you are not one of us. People will come out here in the United States and try to act like you're not one of us, but they can't take away that basic right. Everybody knows that black people built America. You can't go to Europe and find that. So that's one of our assets.
And like Brother Henderson, Dr.
We built that too.
No doubt, no doubt. That's what the Queen Crown Jewels. You know, that's a whole other conversation. But what Dr. Henderson is talking about the perception being taught that we have less than we do is very true. And one of the key ways it's happened for my generation has been in music. I'll answer your question specifically, brother, on how it came to be that we started to define ourselves in a certain way, particularly through hip hop. In 1971, the Columbia Records Group commissioned a report from Harvard Business School. Anybody here work in the music industry? Nobody. All right. Well, I'm going to break it down quickly. They commissioned a report from the Harvard Business School that people in the industry know as the Harvard Report. And it was basically a report on how they could look into the race music or the soul music industry at the time. And these business students came back with a variety of different recommendations. With how you could deal with local retail and build relationships with local radio and all of this stuff that could help you build a relationship with the black community and more business and enterprise. Now, they rejected virtually all the recommendations, but they noted one thing, and that was that you had a lot of stuff that would chart on the, quote, race music charts that would then later on translate onto the top 40. And they're like, wow, wait a minute. That means that we could target our marketing to this relatively small demographic, thereby minimizing or mitigating risk. And if something's successful, then you can extrapolate it to a broader demographic. Then you put in the big money. Since 1972, when that report was released, the major record labels started to build, one by one, black music divisions. So since about the mid-1970s, virtually all of the black music that you will hear on the radio is targeted towards white people. It's not made for you. They might look good, they might sound good, they might have come up out of your neighborhood, but that's how funk becomes disco, right? That's how in the 80s R&B starts to lose some of its soul and start to be a little bit of a clown show. And that's how hip hop goes from, you know, hard, like Public Enemy, political thinking. People talk about gangster rap. Gangster rap started with NWA. If you listen to the stuff they were talking about on Straight Outta Compton, there's a ton of politics in there. You take a next step and look at what Ice Cube drops with America's Most Wanted, it's a whole other level of politics there. Then you get to the point where you have Snoop Dogg releasing the Dog Pound, and it's gone. And it's not because Snoop didn't grow up hearing all these political issues. It's because you can draw a direct line between the consolidation of the record industry, the big labels buying up the little independent labels, and black music going from, oh, we can talk about anything, to just straight up nihilism. And I'm speaking specifically about hip hop there. So I would say the answer to your question is straight up economic. For a big label, having a massive overhead, trying to figure out how do we make something that's profitable, it is easier to say, hey, let's test it with these black kids. There's only a few of them. If it works, we got to sell it to white kids. And 60, 70% of the consumers of hip hop music are suburban white males. If you're going to say to that kid, I got this artist, he's singing about black nationalism, how do you relate to that as a young white suburban kid? But if I say to you, yo, he gonna sing about fat booties and guns, and it's gonna be a dude with muscles, he get all the girls, and he'll bust a cap in anybody that doesn't look like you, maybe that translates. And we as a community have deified the artists who are basically getting pimped by the people who sign their paychecks. And we have said, these are the arbiters of blackness. These are the exemplars of what a black man should be. I travel all around the world, and I would always have this little thing when people would see me as a young black male, and they would have a certain expectation until around about 2007, 2008, when the predominant image of a black male in the cultural mindset of the globe ceased to be a dude with a pants hanging half down off his ass with a gun ready to slap a black woman or shoot a black kid. Nobody else, just us. And it started to be a young brother coming out of Chicago who looked like he could be president. It is incumbent upon us to change that imagery, and we have the power to do so if we choose to.
Thank you. We're actually probably getting done on time. Let's take your question, and then we'll get responses and wrap up.
All right, peace and black power. My name is Brother Derrick. I'm an activist with National Black United Front and Malcolm X grassroots movement here in D.C. And so this morning I brought up the question of black folks here in 2012 using alternative measures to gain a certain goal. And the panel basically buck danced around my question. And I basically said that from the time of Emancipation Proclamation, or all the way up to us receiving the opportunity to vote, here in 2012, we are still implementing the same tactics that have not worked. So my best solution is that we organize under the premises of black nationalism. Here in DC, which was a city, a black epicenter for black culture, black businesses, and that no longer exists. I'm coming from Northeast DC. I still live in a prominent black neighborhood, but we do not run the economics, we do not run the political system, we do not run the educational, so forth. I'm just saying that we need to present alternative measures. Because anybody, in my book, anybody can vote. One thing I do is show up to a poll, punch, go through the process, then you just leave. But I'm just saying now, what are some of the competitive measures that we can take to, build as a nation of our own?
All right, before we get to that question, let's take this as well. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Finley. I'm from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And adding on to him, I wanted to talk about redistricting, because there are a number of states around this country that has been hit. In Wisconsin, we were hit with the redistricting where we lost 3 African-American seats in our legislature. When you're talking about organizing and black empowerment and our people are so apathetic, what do we do?
All right, so first question on black nationalism, alternative measures outside of the American polity. Second question has to do with tactics used within redistricting. So let's go to Dr. Henderson. What is your take on alternative measures of black nationalism, if you will, if that's tantamount to black empowerment?
Yeah, well, there are quite a few organizations. You mentioned some of them, brother, the NBUF especially, and NBUF has powerful chapters all over the country. The thing is, it goes back to what we were saying before about demystifying some of these things, even alternative ones like revolution. When Minister Malcolm died, in the charter of the OAU, he says that the OAU would launch a cultural revolution. Now check this out. This is Malcolm. Malcolm in Message to Grassroots. He says revolution is based on land. It involves bloodshed. That's Malcolm X, 1963 in Detroit, King Solomon's Church, right? Malcolm, 1964, said these words exactly, but America's in a unique position. She's the only country in history in a position actually to become involved in a bloodless revolution. Well, how do you reconcile those two, Malcolm? You said revolution is bloody. Now you said a culture, you said you can have a nonviolent revolution or a revolution that don't involve bloodshed. He was talking about culture revolution that was going to precede any type of political or physical one. So the issue is to study those revolutions. But I don't accept that we haven't had this, we haven't built on the successes. Some of the difficulties we have now are actually rooted in the successes. Right. And that's the Malcolm side. For the King side, King talked about integration, but King's integration wasn't Roy Wilkins' integration. Roy Wilkins didn't like to see in the NAACP, you see? So what did Roy Wilkins talk about integrate into society more like assimilation, right? But that's not what Martin King was saying. Martin King was not interested in integrating the black church out of existence. Is that fair to say? He wasn't even interested in integrating Morehouse College out of existence.
Neither are most.
He wasn't interested in integrating Alpha Phi Alpha, his fraternity, out of existence. So how do you do it, Martin? How do you have integration in independent black institutions? Well, just like Malcolm, he was killed before he turned 40. So a lot of us need to build on what they were building on at the time instead of proceeding as if we're grounded in this, we tried all this stuff, nothing worked, as if white supremacy doesn't even control you. White supremacy don't just tell you what to think, it tell you how to think. You got no successes, you got nothing to build on, nothing ain't worked. Are you serious? How did we get here then? How did we thrive here then? Most black folks are not poor. 25% of us are, and that's way too much. Most black folks have never been, since our liberation, have been in prison. No people are defined by the people in prison. There are not more black men in prisons than schools. That ain't never been so. We so quick to believe these things. And then we dismiss those folks who made a way for us. And we act like we did stuff in our time. Miss Rosa Parks told me this when she was organized in Detroit in the 90s. She said, Brother Errol, she said, long as I'm breathing, it's my time. If she only made the contribution she made when she got to Detroit, she would still have monumental contributions. And we dismiss on them. We just dismissed all that literature, all that practice, all that theory by saying we don't got nothing. And this is why people can run the same game, because we don't study, enough of us don't, study some of the old strategies and apply them in a novel way. So I don't knock anything that I've heard on this panel. But we got to talk about hip hop some more, brother. But I don't knock anything I heard on this panel. But from Donna Brazile and voting to organizing in churches, there's many ways to do this and to be patient with our people and organize and meet us where we are and be patient. And brother, I suggest you read a 1996 piece I wrote called Black Nationalism and Rap Music, so you get an answer to you, another additional to what brother supplied as well. Stop there.
Thank you. Before we wrap up, I want to get closing remarks from Dr. Price and Derrick. And thank you all for being with us this long. And then just stay tuned. I'll tell you a little bit more about the voting toolkit if some of you didn't get it. So Dr. Price.
The thing that I think is so funny is that when you're talking to Errol, like face to face, he is still talking that loud. Like no matter where you are, in what condition, that is exactly the conversation you are having all the time. So don't think he's putting it on for y'all. This is really like you meet him in the airport. He gonna be yelling at you just like that. I was like, I don't ever want to teach next door to you. I could never get a word in edgewise in my own class. The thing that I wanted to say to the brother from the National Black United Front is that Black nationalism is as old as America, right? But it is just like support for integration, just like all these other movements, they have adapted over time. And if you think about the best and most successful movements and protests of their times, it was just a few people who got together with an idea, right? I mean, we think about the student movement of the 1960s as something really important, but if you really think about it, really, it's just a couple students over, in North Carolina who say, I'm gonna sit in. Nobody thought it was a good idea. They didn't ask nobody. They didn't, think ahead of time. Maybe I should talk to my counselor, or maybe I should go ask the police if they'll protect me in the moment. They didn't do any of that stuff. And at the same time, you had students over in Fisk, just a couple of them having a study group who had planned to come back after Christmas break. And they were going to come back and start a sit-in. You only need you and 3 other people to start something, right? I think the thing that we think about is the idea of national movements. And one of the reasons why I think we always think that there's nothing happening is because it's not a national movement. In every city in this country, you got a group of black women who are trying to stop the violence. The Interrupters in Chicago, if you don't know who they are, they go out there and they stop. They get in between fights in the middle of urban Chicago. It's not a lot of them. It's like 5 or 6 of them. They ride around, stopping fights. And so the thing that I think we tend to think about is that these things have to be grand scale. If we are in the right moment politically, sometimes that expands into a much larger thing. But the vast majority of the important work to be done in politics, and especially in the black community, is going to be local and stuff you never get recognized for. Right? I mean, if you're looking for sort of the national, if you're looking for the NAACP to be, with you on that corner, that's not what they do. Right? And so if you are going to be involved locally, one of the things that you need to get used to is understanding the politics of your locality and the politics of doing a lot with a few people. Actually, any organization, if you think about it, it's all about doing a lot with a few people. My mother goes to a church with 8,000 people in it. How did I know 15 people who were always involved in stuff? Do you see what I'm saying? And so I think that's the thing that you need to think about. The other thing is about, I try to be careful about calling people apathetic. I think the thing is people don't understand the importance of redistricting. People don't understand the importance of the census, and that has been done intentionally. I think 2010 was crucially important, probably more important than 2008, because we have to suffer under the leadership that was created after the census. You have to suffer for a decade for what happened, right? I mean, if Barack Obama had lost, we would have been real mad. Some of us probably would have never voted again. But 10 years from now, we wouldn't still be sitting here having meetings about it, right? 10 years from now, you're going to still be having meetings about what happened in 2010. Why? Because that stuff matters because of the constitutionally mandated census. And I think if people understood more closely how important redistricting is, then they would be more interested. It's not apathy, it's lack of information and true understanding of how politics works. Part of that is our fault because we focus, the people who are activists focus so much on voting and national politics. When I teach Intro to American Government, the first thing I tell people, if you don't know who your mayor is, you already losing in the political game, right? If you see, this is no lie, I taught at a lily white liberal arts institution, and I would tell them, if you see a white woman jogging through a black neighborhood with her dog, your neighborhood is already gone and you don't even know it, right? If you don't own your house, you might as well pack up and start looking for housing elsewhere. Your neighborhood is gone. And part of that is because we aren't as informed as we need to be about how local, how individual, and how small politics really is before we ever make it to that grand sort of national scale.
Thank you, Derrick.
I mean, just like briefly, I think that, again, for me, there's another aspect of this that is also crucially important, and that is the economic empowerment. I would say that, my background is peculiar. I moved to a new country every 4 years from the time I was born until I was 20. Like, I've been around the world. I speak a bunch of different languages. When I think coalition building, the first thing that comes to my mind is not race. Part of that is I remember having an argument with actually a brother from the New Black Panther Party that we were working on a project together, actually, back in Boston. And he was very concerned about what white people were doing to us. And I was saying to him, like, honestly, bro, like, I can only go so far with you because everybody that I can point to that has made my life and the life of my family so hard, has made it so I can't go home. The people who made it so that, they didn't just kill you because you don't agree with the government. They disappeared you. We don't know where the bodies were. There were no funerals. The people who destroyed what I was or could have had growing up all look like me. So my mentality starts off different.
But the people who helped you too look like you.
Yes, exactly, right? So I don't look at blackness as in this sets me apart, or even that's who I have to have or that's who I don't want. I see the opportunity all over the place. That's why I'm like, why is it that brothers in Detroit are not talking to brothers in Dakar? Because there's a commonality, there's an opportunity there. Not only that, but I'm like, well, why are brothers in Inglewood not talking to, Vatos in East LA? Because there's an opportunity there. And believe me, you're talking about the GOP Republicans, they're looking right now how they can start speaking better Spanish. Word is born. I was at the RNC and the DNC, and they know they screwed. The numbers alone are on our side, but who is us? So the thing that I would want to convey is like, it's two things. One, we are not nearly in as bad a position as people would want to think. We have come so far. We are ahead of so many people. I swear to God, if you look at the status of black folks in the United States, with the status of the country with the largest black population outside of Nigeria. I'm not talking about outside of Africa. I mean, outside of Nigeria, it's Brazil. Brazil got more black folks than South Africa, Ghana, Senegal combined, right? It is the second largest African nation on the planet. You look at where we are versus where they are, it's a whole different world. We got to build on our successes. We have to recognize the power that we do have. When I'm in school, they're talking all the time about Du Bois and his thinking vis-a-vis Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington, economic empowerment. W. Du Bois, civil rights. We got to get the rights in order to have the economic empowerment. And that was an argument from a century ago. Now, I would argue that we're at the point where we've advanced in both, that the two hands should wash each other to the degree to which we can look at where industry and opportunity is going. And we can encourage our black youth not just to learn about our culture, but to study math. Study math and physics, right?
Study math and physics, because when you come out of school, you're going to get a better job. You're going to have more cash in your pocket. You're going to get a better financial advisor. You ain't got to wait to get in the NBA to be rich. You can start your own thing. If we start training our youth that way, a lot of this stuff starts to change. I go into rooms and people will see me and they'll be like, who is this young Negro? Right? And they'll act one way. Then they read the resume and they see what I'm there for, and their whole attitude change. And the ones who don't know how to change it, I dismiss them because I don't need them. Right? There's another element, and it's parallel to everything we've been discussing, but we don't need nobody to help us teach our kids better math. The white kids don't even want to do it. We could take over in the next 5-6 years off of that alone. That's power.